In 1695, Scotland bet everything on a swamp in Panama and lost a third of the nation's wealth. The story we're taught is simple. Scottish merchants were desperate to compete with England and Spain in global trade. They needed a shortcut across Central America, so they pooled their money, bought land in Darien, and built a colony. It failed, the end, but the price tag, what it actually cost Scotland, reveals something far darker about how empires gamble and lose. Let's start with the numbers everyone cites. Around 1695, the Company of Scotland was chartered with an ambitious goal: establish a trading post in Darien, modern-day Panama, that would bypass the long route around Africa and the Cape of Good Hope. The company raised £400,000 sterling. In today's money, that's roughly $60 to $80 million. Not small change. Here's what made it seem reasonable at the time. Geography looked like a gift. Darien was narrow, a foothold there could control trade flowing between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. No more sailing 5 months around South America. English and Dutch merchants were already wealthy from colonial ventures. Why not Scotland? The logic seemed airtight. But there's a detail that changes everything. The investors who funded this scheme weren't random merchants. They were Scotland's landowning elite, the same people who controlled Parliament, the courts, the military. This wasn't a business venture. It was a political bet, and they were betting with other people's money. The first expedition set sail in 1698 with 3 ships and around 200 colonists. What happened next is where the accepted story breaks down. We're told disease and Spanish hostility killed the colony. True, but incomplete. The colonists arrived during the rainy season. They had no experience farming in tropical climates. Their supplies were inadequate, and critically, they had no idea what they were actually landing in. The real killer wasn't Spanish guns or tropical fever alone. It was that the entire premise was built on a fantasy. Darien's location wasn't a gift, it was a death trap. Swampy, disease-ridden, isolated. The indigenous Kuna people already lived there and weren't interested in Scottish trade, and the Spanish, who controlled the region, saw the colony as a direct threat to their monopoly on New World resources. Within months, colonists were dying at a rate of 1 or 2 per day. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, diseases the expedition had no resistance to. By 1699, the first wave had collapsed, but here's where the real financial disaster starts. The Scottish Parliament didn't abandon the project. They sent a second expedition, then a third, more money, more ships, more people. By 1700, it was over. The Spanish had blockaded the colony, supplies were exhausted, and the survivors were evacuating. But the Company of Scotland didn't just lose the £400,000 in direct investment. They'd borrowed heavily to fund the expeditions. Ships had to be purchased, supplies stockpiled, salaries paid to administrators who never set foot in Darien. The actual cost to Scotland's economy was closer to double that figure. Now here's where we flip the narrative. The Darien scheme wasn't primarily a failed colonial venture. It was a wealth transfer disguised as commerce. The Scottish nobility had convinced the merchant class and common people to invest in a project they'd essentially designed to fail, or at least to fail in ways that enriched the insiders. Here's the mechanism. Those who controlled the company board had already made money through contracts, shipbuilding, supply provisioning, administrative fees. When the colony failed, they'd already extracted their cut. The losses fell on ordinary investors who'd bought shares expecting returns. The Scottish economy lost a third of its liquid capital in roughly 5 years. And the consequences were brutal. Scottish banks collapsed. Families who'd invested their fortunes were ruined. The country's credit rating, what we'd call sovereign debt, tanked. Foreign investors stopped lending to Scotland. The economy contracted sharply. Within a decade, Scotland's independence itself was threatened, not by military invasion but by bankruptcy. This is the real story. The Darien scheme wasn't a bold attempt at empire building that happened to fail. It was a speculative bubble inflated by insiders, sold to the public as patriotism, and managed in ways that guaranteed ordinary people would bear the losses while elites protected their positions. The financial engineering was sophisticated. For 1695, the company board issued shares to the public, creating the illusion of broad ownership. But decision-making power, where ships were built, who supplied goods, what routes were taken, remained with a small group of connected merchants and nobles. When things went wrong, that same group had already extracted wealth through contracts and fees. The irony is sharp. Scotland eventually recovered by joining the United Kingdom in 1707, just 7 years after Darien collapsed. The Act of Union granted Scotland access to English colonial markets and credit. What the Darien scheme had promised, wealth through trade, finally came through, but only after Scotland lost its independence and its investors lost their fortunes. So why does Darien matter now? Because it's a template. A charismatic story, building an empire, expanding trade sold to ordinary people as their opportunity. Capital pooled from the public. Insiders making decisions that benefit themselves first. Losses socialized when things collapse. gains privatized when they are available. The machinery hasn't changed much in 330 years. The Darien Scheme cost Scotland roughly £800,000 total, an amount that represented approximately a third of the nation's entire liquid wealth. For context, that's equivalent to wiping out a third of a modern nation's GDP in a single investment. And it happened because the people making the decisions had insulated themselves from the actual consequences of being wrong. That's why it costs what it does, why Scotland paid that price, not because Darien was inherently doomed, though it was, but because the structure of the deal made failure profitable for some and catastrophic for others. The money didn't disappear, it moved from public investors into the pockets of administrators, contractors, and connected merchants, so that's why the bill was so steep. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. If you're interested in how financial bubbles repeat across centuries, subscribe. There's a new unsolved economic mystery every week. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.